So a little bit about me. I am a Christian Sabbath keeper. No, I'm not Hebrew roots. No, I don't belong to the Church of God Seventh-day or Seventh-day Adventist, and I'm not a Messianic Jew. But I am a Christian who believes that the seventh-day Sabbath is a command of God, and I keep it. And I don't keep it because I believe it offers me some sort of salvation. I don't believe that I can ever earn my salvation at all. It's only by the grace of God that salvation is granted to people. But I do believe that focusing on what God has commanded us to do and doing those things out of love for Him and what He's done for us is the right thing that a Christian should do. And so I keep the seventh-day Sabbath for that reason. And I have a ton of reasons why I think the seventh-day Sabbath is still relevant and legitimate as a command of God to Christians today. But today, I just want to go over one reason. And this is actually an argument from silence, which is about the worst thing you can do when trying to convince people that what you have to say has any validity or legitimacy at all, because an argument from silence is typically a logical fallacy. And that's not something you use to convince people at all. That's something people are supposed to call you out on. But I think we'll see today that not all arguments from silence are illegitimate. They can often be used as evidence. And so we're going to go over two arguments from silence today, one that is pro seventh-day Sabbath and one that is against the seventh-day Sabbath. And these are reasons that people often use on their own. These are things that I've heard in passing talking with other people. It's not something I made up. I'm not trying to create a straw man for one side and a steel man for the side that I'm on. I'm trying to offer two legitimate reasons people give that just happen to both be arguments from silence. But one of them, I think we'll see, has a lot more strength and validity as evidence for the Sabbath. And so let's get into it. I don't want to waste any more time, but I do want to go over first what an argument from silence is, because some people might not be familiar with logical fallacies or logical reasoning. And so certain sources that I found online, I didn't want to just make up a definition based on what I understood. I wanted to actually go to some sources and find legitimate definitions. Say this: an argument from silence treats the absence of evidence as evidence itself enough to draw a conclusion. It is also drawing a conclusion based on the silence of an opponent, whether that's a person right in front of you or an argument you're trying to kind of discourse with back and forth. And for those of you that this still doesn't make any sense to, I want to give you an example, just a commonplace example. Imagine I come into the house and I'm missing my keys. I don't know where they are. I've searched everywhere. And so I go to a person sitting on the couch and I say, "Where are my keys?" And they just turn their head and look at me. I might be tempted to say, "I knew you stole my keys," depending on how well I knew the person, if they were trying to prank me or not, or depending on the face they made. This might be the conclusion that I reach. But this is a logical fallacy. Now, it's not to say that the person's silence could not be evidence. It could. This silence and this look could be evidence that they took them, but it is not proof that they took them. And so I'm not justified in jumping to the conclusion that they automatically took them. There could be a lot of reasons they're silent. Maybe they have a cold and they can't speak very well. Maybe they didn't hear me the first time. Who knows what could have happened, but it's not proof. William Lane Craig, who is one of my all-time favorite apologists, outlines this really well. It's kind of a confusing quote, but I hope you follow me. He says this: absence of evidence is only evidence of absence when, if the thing were true, we should expect to see evidence and we don't. I've also been reading The Everlasting Man by G.K. Chesterton, and he says this. Now, he's talking about paganism here and how it lacks God, and yet this lack of God seems to point to a desire for God. But he says this: in our special sacramental sense, there is, in paganism, of course, the absence of the presence of God. But there is also, in a very real sense, the presence of the absence of God, meaning there's a hole here and it should be filled by God. And the pagans knew there's a hole here. They knew they were missing something. And they strove for it. They desired it. And so this hole was actually evidence for the true God. And we see that when Paul goes and talks to pagan people, he realizes they've been seeking for something, and I have the answer. It's the true God. And so sometimes silence or the absence of evidence can actually act as evidence. So let's get into our first argument from silence and see if this holds up to be true in this argument specifically. Now, this is the one against the Sabbath. Often people will say, the Sabbath isn't listed as a distinct command in the New Testament, so therefore it must not be commanded anymore. Now, does this make sense? It's true. You're not going to find anywhere in the New Testament where it says, thou shalt keep the Sabbath day. But I have a few things that I want to bring up that are problems with this. One, why expect one of the 10 commandments have changed unless it is expressly stated that it has changed or has been changed? This doesn't make sense to me. The rest of the commandments are valid to people. 1 through 9 are fine, or 1 through 10 is fine, except for number 4, keep the Sabbath day. That's the only one that gets thrown out. Why should we expect that all the rest are maintained, but one has been changed when there is no statement saying it has been changed? That's mysteriously missing. Number 2, the commands of God as a whole are countless times mentioned. So why should this one command not be included any longer? Paul talks about not being under the law, yes, but he doesn't say the commandments of God have been done away with. All Christians know that God commands certain things. He wants us to live rightly according to what he's commanded us to do. Why should the Sabbath be removed from this? We have to have good reason why. It's not enough to say that they just don't say it, especially when the 10 commandments as a whole are mentioned often as expectations for Christians to continue to keep. Number 3, the New Testament church, at least early on, there is no person in the world that would say that the New Testament church was not keeping the seventh-day Sabbath, at least early on. If you want to say it changed, that's a whole different argument. But at least early on, they were keeping the seventh-day Sabbath. And so why, when these letters are being sent to the churches that we now know as the New Testament, these letters made up the New Testament, why, when they're sending them to churches to be read on the seventh-day Sabbath, would they include in them a reminder to keep the seventh-day Sabbath that they're already keeping? The silence here actually makes sense based on what is happening. Now, on the contrary to this, Hebrews does say not to forsake the assembling of yourselves together. And some might say, well, that could be any day. It doesn't have to be Saturday. It doesn't have to be a seventh day. And yet, also in Hebrews, it says there remains a Sabbath rest for God's people. So we have legitimate evidence that the Sabbath continued on. So the absence of an express command not to keep the Sabbath cannot be counted as evidence. Now let's look at the argument from silence for the Sabbath. The Jewish people, who wanted nothing more than to delegitimize the Christian church, never, ever bring it up. Not one time. There's not one time you're going to find in all of Scripture or all of historical writings where the Jewish people were angry at the Christians for not keeping the Sabbath. Consider how many times in the New Testament they're dealing with the topic of physical circumcision, on the other hand. Physical circumcision is no longer the sign of the new covenant. It was the sign of the old covenant, right? And so the Christians are no longer requiring people to be physically circumcised because they're under a new covenant with new signs. But the Jewish people had a problem with this. They saw this as too much of a departure from who they were. And so it separated them. It made them think, no, this is absolutely a thing that we have to rail against. We have to fight against. We cannot allow for this. And even Jewish Christians in the church had trouble accepting the fact that you no longer had to be physically circumcised. And so the church is defending their point over and over and over again in the New Testament. The early church had no problem defending their teachings and beliefs that were contrary to the Jewish and Old Covenant ways of thinking. So why not the Sabbath? The Sabbath, in a first century Jewish person's mind, was on par with circumcision. Think about this. The Old Testament states that it was in part because they abandoned the Sabbath that Israel was taken into captivity by Assyria. And so Judah knew all too well how important the Sabbath was. Breaking the Sabbath equals God's wrath. That's what they saw. They knew the Sabbath was important to God. And so an abandonment of the Sabbath was incredibly important and something they would have fought tooth and nail against. If Christians were abandoning one of the big 10 commandments, you should expect to hear a good amount of dissent from Jewish leaders on this topic, but you don't. It typically revolves around things like circumcision. Think about this too. If you weren't circumcised, yes, in the Jewish mindset, you were not part of the Jewish people. But if you were abandoning the Sabbath, you were actively hurting the Jewish people by bringing God's wrath on you. This was their historical context. So if you abandon the Sabbath, it's not only are you not a part of us, you are apostatizing, which is going to bring God's wrath down on us. You are actively against us. And so it makes sense. Yes, they'd be against not circumcising anymore because that's what makes them who they are. That's a sign of who they are as people and their relationship with God. But not keeping the Sabbath should have been talked about. You would expect it would be if Christians were abandoning it, because it would actually bring God's wrath. It would mean you are an enemy of the Jewish people, an enemy of God. On the contrary, if you survey the history of Jewish and Christian relationships, you'll see that the Romans almost could not distinguish between the two. You'd think it'd be pretty easy if the Jews are keeping Saturday and the Christians are keeping Sunday. That's a pretty huge delineator of who is who, but the Romans just could not figure out who was who. Additionally, throughout historical context, you can see the Jewish people instituted a spoken prayer. Now, some say this was just prior to 70 AD, some say it was years later, but it doesn't matter. Either way, it's after the time of the Bible. And this prayer, this spoken prayer in church, was a curse on heretics. They actually called it a blessing on heretics, but it was a curse. It's called the Birkat Haminim, and it called out specifically those who apostatized to Christianity, because a Christian would never, ever call out this curse on themselves. I want to read to you one passage from this Birkat Haminim. It says this: "For the apostates, let there be no hope, and uproot the kingdom of arrogance speedily and in our days. May the Nazarenes and the sectarians perish as in a moment. Let them be blotted out of the book of life and not be written together with the righteous. You are praised, O Lord, who subdues the arrogant." This is a spoken prayer that the entire congregation on Shabbat would stand up and say. And so if they looked out and they saw people not reciting that prayer, they knew those are the Christians. We need to get them out. This means that there were Christians still keeping the Sabbath amongst the Jewish people, and the Jewish people were trying to weed them out. Now, make no mistake, Christians are not Jewish, and there's a lot of things that the Jewish people do that are signs of abiding by the old covenant, but the Sabbath is not one of them. God commanded it, Jesus exemplified it and expected it would continue to be kept well after his death and resurrection. You can find this in the scripture below. The apostles in the early church maintained it, and this argument from silence proves it. So I keep it today, and I ask you, what's your reason not to?